We're back, and of course my other piece didn't work because I didn't launch ScreenFlow, so bear with me while I do that. So here's ScreenFlow. Like I said, we're back, and it's, I should say, and we're back. That's the pattern when I do recording, right? And we're back, and it's COMP305. It's week 1, lesson 1, part 2 in the winter semester of 2016, okay? The first part was all about organization. Not sure if you can hear me now. Can you? You're good, you can hear me on YouTube? So it works well, it works okay? Yes, good, excellent. So that means that we're broadcasting. Thank you. So again, I'll be doing a live broadcast. Like I said, this is our second part. So what I'd ask you to do, because this is the second piece, is please bring up your Blender. Now, if you don't have Blender installed on your computer, I'd like you to download it. And where can you get Blender from? Because we're going to start with Blender today, right? You're going to get it from blender.org, right? So please go to blender.org. The latest version is Blender 2.76b. And you can get it. It should also be installed on the system in front of you. So please don't watch. This is not a watch. I'm going to test you on this next week. So please do. Go into your system if you don't have access. If you don't have access to the system, log in as student, right? Worst case scenario, and launch Blender. All right? If you don't have Blender, download it. All right? 2.76b. I'll give you a second to get that. So again, I'm going to be testing you on this, but it's not a Blender course necessarily, but there are going to be components of Blender that we're going to be using. And part of it is going to be the asset creation piece and modification, right? So that's, you want to download Blender 2.76b, again, for Mac. It's cross-platform, actually, it'll work. Mac, Windows, and Linux. Even though I'm using a Mac, doesn't mean you have to, right? If you're using a Mac, great, you're going to be online with me. Again, I'd highly recommend, this is one of the downloads you need to have for this semester. Let me show you another one that I highly recommend for you to have. Texture Packer, if you've done any kind of 2D sprite sheets with me before, then you need this one. And it may be on the machine in front of you, okay? This is not free, this one here. Blender's free and Unity is free. There is no book requirement for this course. I told you it's kind of optional. But Texture Packer is a resource we're going to be using to create and manage sprite sheets. So please, I'd highly recommend you get it. Do you need it? Absolutely. Absolutely not. You can manage on your own. But the great thing about Texture Packer is there's a Texture Packer importer built in for Unity that allows you to bring in a sprite sheet and use it for 2D games. So please, Texture Packer, it's $50. I'm not going to lie to you. It's not free, but it's taking the place of a textbook. So there's no textbook, but there's Texture Packer. I'm going to be using it, and you may not need it for an exam or anything else, but I will be using it for things like, you know, for bringing in sprite sheets into your game. Okay, so that's another one you need. Of course, the big one that we're going to be using is Unity, which you can get from unity3d.com, right? Now, if you notice, Unity is we're at version 5.3 for Unity, unity3d.com. But here on the machines in front of you, you may have Unity 4.69 or something like that, right? So there's a bit of a discrepancy. And it's not really what the capabilities are necessarily, but it's largely in terms of the way we do our scripting. Our scripting will change from one version of Unity to the other. And there are ways we can convert the script from one to the other. I will be dealing with Unity 5 primarily, right? So that's what I recommend that you get. Okay, so that's really where we're going to get. Also, Unity has a great area that we're going to use to learn. There's a Unity Learn section, so unity3d.com/learn. One of your assignments or labs that you're going to be having, and I'm going to ask you to do this, it's kind of going to be homework for next week, is I want you to start some tutorials that are going to be on so that we kind of work together and, you know, you get the most out of Unity by doing the tutorials. Here's what's happened traditionally last semester. No one did the tutorial. And what happened is they got slammed with assignment number 1, and they couldn't get it done because they didn't understand. Please, it's only a tutorial. It doesn't mean that I want you to hand in the tutorial. All right, if I give you a tutorial or if I give you something up here, if I get the exact same tutorial back, you're going to get 0, right? You need to do your own work, right? The tutorial is like that. You can look at it and understand how it works, and then from there make your own. That's what the tutorial is supposed to be all about. Okay, so that's Unity and Unity Learn. There's some areas here that you can, kind of get some free learning. It also has a amazing documentation that's online. So if you actually click on documentation, the Unity manual, that's why the book is cool and everything else, right? But everything you need is here online. All the latest and greatest things about Unity, it's on the Unity manual. And that's one thing I really love about Unity. It's got tons of support and great documentation, and it's easy to learn. All right, it's not like Unreal. Unreal is another great engine to learn, but it's in terms of support, I still haven't seen the same level of documentation and support as I see in Unity. That's just my opinion. Okay, so any questions up to this point? So 3 things you need. Definitely, we're going to start with Blender today. And the other one that I talked about before was, of course, GitHub, right? So if you don't have GitHub, that's your lab for Friday. I'm going to ask you to grab that. I do have a section that I'm going to be sharing with you under Centennial College. Notice that if you scroll down, way down in here, there's COMP305 examples already, right? And I'm going to be just adding additional examples here for our class. Like, for example, there's one for COMP305 Lesson 7 and other ones that we did for last semester. Not going to take those down. Those ones are going to stay up. Nothing is going to be bad about having these up. There's even one that's up here for Space Shooter. Space Shooter is like the finalized version of to start your assignment 1. You can use the Space Shooter, kind of schema, if you will, or as a template, but you'll see that there's some stuff in Space Shooter that we will not be doing, and I'm going to be showing you a different way of doing it. So this may not be exactly the best way to start. There is no boilerplate for Unity. We start off with a kind of a blank document, and we build it from there, right? So that's kind of it in a nutshell. So these are the tools that I'm going to be using with you. There is no text editor that you need because Unity has one built in. It's called MonoDevelop, right? So MonoDevelop is kind of a built-in text editor that kind of pops up when you do your Unity scripting. If you have access to Visual Studio 2013 or 2015 and you want to use that as your text editor, you can certainly point Unity at that one. So you don't have to use the built-in MonoDevelop text editor. And Visual Studio 2013, 2015 is actually gives you great code hinting, and it's really, really cool. So you guys should all have that because you've done, COMP305, yeah? So you could repoint your Unity at that. If you want to use something lightweight like Visual Studio Code, that's also another option. For Unity, you can also point it at code as opposed to MonoDevelop. However, in the past, I've found that MonoDevelop is a little bit better than code in terms of doing things C# for Unity, right? So again, there's some built-in stuff that you can use. Okay, cool. So we've kind of talked about some of the tools you need, and this should have given you time to download and install Blender. Who does not have Blender on the system? And you should have brought that up again already. Please bring Blender up like I asked you to. Again, this is not a watch, kind of course. It's a do course, right? All right, cool. So let's assume we've got Blender up. I'm going to start teaching you Blender kind of from the ground up on this one. This course requires you a little bit of knowledge of Blender. If you've done Blender in COMP391 with me, and I don't think any of you have, right, then you would have been ahead. In this particular case, I'm going to start off with the basics of Blender. Let's do that first. So what the heck is Blender anyway? Let's bring up Blender. Now I'm doing a lot of things at once here, so bear with me if my machine slows down. I'm broadcasting, I'm doing Blender, I'm going to do Unity on the side, right? And it's a lot of stuff going on all at the same time. And I'm also recording locally, right? Lots of stuff going on. So please bear with me. Okay, so Blender, again, is a free open source piece of software application that allows us to do modeling, 3D modeling, if you will, and simulations, right? So it's a really good program for free, right? It's amazing how many things you can do with Blender. First thing to note is the interface itself. Again, I will be testing you on this next week, so please pay attention. Again, and I'll also have this online. You'll have a recording of it, so you can always brush up on it. And some people say, Tom, you know what, your recordings are kind of long. They're like 1 hour or 2 hours each, and it's hard to go through the entire recording to remember it. Yes, it is, but you can always fast forward, right? You can always fast forward through, see what I've talked about, and get the kind of the gist of it. And if I say I'm going to test you on it, if I say this section I'm going to test you on it, I'm going to test you on the section. I'm not lying to you. There's no tricks, right? This is it. I'm telling you. So the interface, I'm going to test you on the interface, right? So whenever you select stuff in Blender, how do you select things in Blender? Does anybody know? if I want to select a model, an object in Blender. Now you see there's a couple things you see up here. One of them is this grid, right? And another thing is there's an image here. Now my image is a little bit skewed, and I apologize for those people who are watching it on the projector because it doesn't look like that on my screen. It's a little bit skewed, but it's actually a cube, right? And you see there's an outline. There's this orange kind of outline that tells you right away from the get-go when Blender starts, this mesh, this cube is selected, right? So how do I select stuff in Blender? Anyone know? Edit mode? No, that doesn't select it. How do I select something sorry? Right click. Yeah, you learned from yesterday, right? Right click. Whenever you do a right click in Blender, right, you can select an object. If you want to deselect an object, you click the A button, right? So A button, there's a lot of shortcut keys you have to remember, right? And this is one of them. A selects or deselects all. So if I click A again, everything is selected, including my camera and my light. Three things that are happening here that you have in Blender when you start off a default file. One of them is your camera on the top left here. There's a mesh, which is a cube, right? There's a light source, which is a point lamp, kind of off in the distance over here, right? You also have a cursor. If you notice this little mark right here, it looks like a thing. If I click anywhere else over here, as an example, this is your three-dimensional cursor, right? We're seeing Blender in this viewport here for the first time in perspective mode, right? And when I mean perspective, if I right-click on the cube again, there's this manipulator arm that comes up. This is the manipulator, if you will, right? And notice that there is a red arrow, a green arrow, and a blue arrow. The red arrow, it points to the x-axis, right? So if I go here, if I move the arrow right and kind of right and left, I left click on the arrow, I can move my object left and right. If you've just done something else where you've clicked somewhere else on the object, that's not going to move everything, right? If I'm clicking on the left, the red arrow here, that's how I'm making a move, okay? And if I want to move it on the y-axis, I'm going to click left-click the green arrow. So I'm going to click the green arrow, moving it back and forth along the y-axis. And if I click the blue arrow, it moves it across the z-axis. Okay, so those are the three axes, right? There are, and don't answer this question, there are three, for those people who were with me yesterday, there are three parts to every three-dimensional component, right? Any three-dimensional mesh that belong to all three-dimensional objects. What are those three parts? Anybody have that? This is a question I'm going to ask you on your test next week. What are the three parts of every three-dimensional mesh that it's out there? You know the answer, people that were with me yesterday, right? So what are they? Can anyone guess? So I have an object. What are three parts to all objects that are 3Ds? Sorry? Axis is not really a component. It's kind of, it tells me the location, the position of an object. What? The coordinates are kind of a property, but that's not really a, it's not, I'm not talking about position. I'm talking about the object itself. Three properties of every object, if you will. Kind of height, width, and length. It's not like that. It's actually, what we have is, those are just properties again. It's vertices, which is kind of where the two edges meet, right? The vertex, which is right here. Edges and faces. Those are the three things. Vertices, edges, and faces. That's going to be your answer for next week when you do one of your questions. I'm not going to give them all to you, but that's one of the ones I'm going to ask you, right? Vertices, edges, and faces. Why? Because every object, even if it's a circle, right, or even if it's a sphere, has all these different kinds of components. Okay, cool. So we have vertices, edges, and faces. That's what you're going to be seeing for every three-dimensional object. All right. And if you notice here in my cube, right, I haven't changed my perspective. I haven't rotated my camera. You can pan around the scene, moving your camera around. Now, if you have a Mac, and if you have a magic mouse, it's just this. See this? That's all I have to do to move my camera around. All right. If you don't have a Mac and you don't have a magic mouse, you need a 3-button mouse. And the way to do that is take your scroll wheel, push down onto it, click the scroll wheel, and drag your scene around. You can drag your scene in any direction with your scroll wheel on a Windows machine. Okay. Actually, it'll work the same if you have a 3-dimensional mouse and you're using it instead of a magic mouse like this. It won't be as easy as this, right? As an example, but it will be nice when you have a three-dimensional mouse, or three button mouse is what I meant. If you click the middle button, or you click the scroll wheel, click down the scroll wheel. Okay, if I scroll in with the scroll wheel, if I actually use the scroll wheel in and out, I can zoom in and out of the scene by actually, you know, scrolling in, like moving the scroll wheel in and out. On the Mac, and if you have a magic mouse, you can also use the control key on the Mac and kind of zoom in and out like that by holding the control key, right? So that's one thing we wanted. We want to be able to zoom into a scene, right? And this is just the perspective camera that we're looking at, the viewport camera. So there's actually a viewport camera, the one that you and I are seeing the scene with, right? And I can scroll in and out with that camera, right? I can actually scroll right into the objects. I'm actually looking inside the object right now. Can't see, but I'm actually looking inside the object, right? Or I can kind of zoom out, right? Again, if I want to pan around, I can do that. I can pan around up and down with my scroll wheel. That's what I want to be doing sometimes, right? Or I want to zoom in and out of an object. Blender requires us to have a full keyboard, okay? And unfortunately for Mac users, if you don't have a full keyboard, then you're going to have to buy one, you know, kind of an extra one on the side like I have. Mine just seems to be a little dead, right? Which means I have to charge it, right? So I'm going to point to your numeric keypad, which should be on any keyboard that you have. I'm going to be talking about your numeric keypad, and the numeric keypad has shortcut keys to change your perspective, because when we do any kind of manipulation of the mesh, if I'm going to do modeling at all, I'm going to need to do it with an orthographic perspective at times, and I need this keyboard. So if I press on with the keyboard, if I press the 1 button on the numeric keypad, look what happens to my scene. It goes into a front perspective mode, right? So this is the front. So I'm actually eliminating my angle, okay? Now, if I want to make it orthographic, I press the 5 button on my numeric keypad, 5. If you don't have a numeric keypad because you have a Mac, then you can also do it like this. If you go to View, there's a View menu. You can always go to your different sides here. So if I want to look at the top or the front, I can look at front. If I want to look at the top with my menu, I can go to the View menu here and look at top. And that'll just change the way we're looking at an object. So I'm actually looking at this object from the top. The shortcut key for the numeric keypad is 7 for the top, 7. 1 for the front, 7 for the top. See how it changes the perspective. 3 for the right. Here's right ortho. Why do I care? Why do I want to have this? Why do I want to look at objects in these kind of perspectives? Because it's easier for me to manipulate an object and model it by looking at only a flat surface, as opposed to looking at it in 3D. 3D modeling, and if you model like that, messes you up because you think it's here, but it's actually here, or over here, or on here, right? So whereas this one specifically, you know this is from the side, right? So we model. Now if I was to rotate my mouse, notice how I'm getting a user ortho mode. So if I press down on my middle scroll wheel and move around here like this, you can see that it's not quite perspective mode. And on the top left, it tells me user ortho mode, right? Ortho is orthographic. That's what it stands for, right? If I want to go to perspective, I got to click the 5 button on the numeric keypad. That gives me back my perspective mode, more of a 3D look to it. Or you can go into View, and if you look at View Perspective or Ortho, it's View right here in this menu. Okay, so you can do it both ways. You can kind of shift between the two. I find it faster to do the shortcut keys, and that's why I'm telling you these shortcut keys and what they are, because we'll be using the shortcut keys a lot. All right, so the main viewport. This is the main 3D viewport, okay, in Blender. Okay, so we've talked about summary. Three things, properties that all three-dimensional objects have: vertices, edges, and faces. Right? We've talked about that whenever we select something with Blender, which is a little different than other programs, we right-click. We don't left-click. Left-click doesn't do that. Left-click manipulates. Right-click selects. Right? We have 3 objects that come in as a default. When you open up a default scene in Blender, your default file, your camera, your cube, and your light source, which is a point lamp. You have the manipulator arm that tells us the direction or the coordinates of your object. And let's see if you can maneuver your object so it looks like mine. I want to move my perspective so that the x-axis, the blue, or the red arrow, or the red axis here, if you can see it on the screen, is right to left, and my y-axis, the green axis, is up and down. I'm going to pull my cube so it's kind of in the middle, right? And if you can see that there's the blue, you see the blue axis like this. Here's where Blender's a little different than other programs like Maya or 3D Studio Max. Blender uses a Z-up perspective, right? Whereas Maya or 3D Studio Max uses a Y-up perspective. It's a little different, and so does Unity. So we're going to be importing this into Unity. Unity needs Y-up. Blender gives you Z-up, so we have to convert it. If we want to take objects from Blender into Unity, we're going to have to import them in as with a different perspective. So some different things to note. Okay, cool. We're just talking about the interface here. Right now we are in object mode, right? In object mode in Blender, all you can do is manipulate and transform the objects. You cannot model in this mode, okay? The only way you can model is in edit mode. You can't model objects in object mode. You can move them around. On the right, notice that on the right, you have the outliner. I'm just gonna open it up a little bit so you can see it. You can manipulate these panels the way you like, by the way. On the right, this right panel. And by the way, things to note with Blender, wherever my mouse is, if it's on the right panel, or the middle panel, or on the left panel, there are different commands, the different shortcut keys, all right? Even on the bottom panel, right? So a shortcut key that will work nicely here, and if you move your mouse over here, won't work. Because this shortcut, the shortcut key like an X or an X or Y or something else, will work differently here than here. Here, if you press X, it'll delete your cube. Let's try that, X. See, it brings up the delete menu, right? And if I click delete, it's gone. There's no more cube anymore in our hierarchy. And if you notice on the right-hand side, you see that there's certain things in the outliner. I have something called render layers. I have the world. I can modify the world itself because every scene is its own world in Unity and in Blender, right? There's the camera. If I click on the camera, left click on the camera, I can highlight it here. If I left click on this side, I can highlight the lamp, right? So those are the two things I can do. I can highlight things by clicking them on the left clicking inside the inspector here in the outliner, right? I can do that. I can't right click here. Right clicking will bring up a menu. Right clicking only works here, right? So please notice that that happens, all right? There's a different way of doing things. So right now, if you notice, when I've clicked on my camera, I can't see it. Is it still in my scene? Yes, it is. Remember, there is a camera, a perspective view that we get from this little box that's right in here. This is our viewport. And if I scroll out, notice how I can see the camera. There's the camera right here. So where is the camera looking? The camera is not looking at my scene, right? Like it's not looking at my light. It's looking down here, right? How do I know where the camera is looking? Well, if I kind of move the camera into position, and you try this as well, and I zoom in, wherever the top of my camera, I'm going to highlight my camera by right-clicking. And if you notice that this arrow that points to in my camera is the top of the camera. Imagine you're looking through the camera, and this square or this rectangle here represents what the camera sees. So as I'm looking through the camera, and if you notice, I'm just getting a little closer so you can see it, right? This rectangle is what the camera sees, not what I'm looking at. I can look at the scene and model the scene over here, but the only thing that will be rendered when I actually render the scene, and we'll have to render the scene in Blender as well, is something where the camera looks through. Okay, so again, camera and lamp. We're not going to go too much into camera. I just wanted to mention that it's there, and those are the three objects that always get loaded up. Okay, hey, I made a mistake. I got rid of my cube, and I want it back. A couple ways I can do it. I can try and undelete or whatever, but let's just load up my file again. Start over. So I'm going to go File, New. Now, I can't move my mouse after I do that. If I move my mouse away, it just goes away, right? I got to do it again. File, New. And if you notice, it says Reload Startup File. There's also Command N or Control N on your PC, right? And when I do that, I'm back to the default startup file. All right, so my cube is back. My cursor is in the default position, right? My manipulator arm is in the middle. I've got my camera here, my light source over there. Everything is back. So if you want to reset, just load up your default file again, and you're back to normal again, okay? On the right, notice how I have my again, my outliner, this is my outliner, and my cube is in my outliner. And also on the right, there's a bit of additional information I've got. This is almost like my properties for my highlighted object. This is a context-sensitive component menu that only works for each component. For example, when I've right-clicked on my cube, I get some certain options. If I right-click on my camera, some of the options change. Same thing when I right-click on my light. So depending on what I've selected, this context-sensitive inspector changes. By the way, this is almost identical in Unity in terms of the way it functions. You have an inspector in Unity, you have an inspector in Blender. Both sides are context-sensitive to what you're clicking in the scene. All right, on the left, and we'll take a short break in a second. On the left there's a transform menu, right? The transform menu allows us to do things like transform the actual object that I've clicked on. So if I right-click on the object, and if I click translate up here, right, it allows me to move my object in a random way with no kind of restrictions, right? By the way, translate, if I hover over it, gives you my shortcut key, which is the G key. So if I press the G key and I move this object around wherever I like, right, I can move this object freely in three-dimensional space without any control or constraint. That's bad, right? Okay, cool. So that's one thing. The arrows, again, the manipulator restricts me to a certain motion. I also have rotate. If I click the rotate button, I can rotate my object freely in three-dimensional space. Well, that's pretty ugly, right? And if I hover over rotate, notice how it's the R button. So if I press the R button, it's the same thing, right? Rotate for the R button. Okay. And notice I have this little arm that comes out, and it comes up from the middle of the object because the focal point for every object by default is the middle, the true center of the object in three-dimensional space. That is the rotation point, or the pivot point, if you will, right? Pivots in three-dimensional space like this. Okay. But what about if I want control? I don't want it just to rotate randomly like that. I'm going to start up a new scene. So I'm going to go File, New, reload my scene again. And in my default scene, I'm going to zoom in, and I want control when I rotate. I press the R key, again for rotate, and then I press one of the axes, X, Y, or Z. If I press X, now I'm rotating only across the Z axis, right? Much more control, right? If I press the Shift key while I'm rotating, I rotate a lot slower. Notice how I'm rotating, but not very, very fast. I can also press the Control key, and it's going to give me almost like these little steps, these chunks, if you will. It's going to snap to the next chunk of rotation. Notice how on the bottom left-hand corner over here, I'm just going to escape. Escape cancels your translation before you've done anything, right? Left-click accepts your translation. Let me show you that again. So I press R, and then I press the X key, and then I rotate, right, by pressing the Shift key or the Control key, right? And then I want to stop right here. In order for me to stop and actually accept the rotation, I got to press the left mouse button. That accepts the rotation. Notice how it's rotated, and my angle is 17.81 degrees, right? I want to undo that by Control or Command Z, right? And if I want more of a numeric control over this, instead of me just doing it randomly, I'm just going to pull this to the side a second. I'm going to press the N key. N as in Norman. And it's going to press up another little numeric control menu. This gives you numeric control over the location of your object, right? So there's X, Y, and Z control for your objects, right? This is the location. And notice there is a number here, -2.25. What is that number? Is that like meters? Is that like feet? What is it? Huh? It's Blender units. That's what it is, right? It is a meaningless number. It's a number that's relative to Blender, right? If you want to do things for Unity, we have to convert everything to meters, okay? If we don't convert to meters, the scale will be off when you model in Blender. So if I create something in Blender, like a tower or something else, a gun, whatever, I don't know, a baby's crib, right? Whatever I'm creating in Blender, and I put it into Unity, the scale will be way off. It'll be like too big or too small, right? So we want to work in meters, right? When we want to bring things into Unity, and I'll show you how to do that later. But for now, notice that the location is the location in terms of our grid system that you see here on the background. This is our grid, and it's in Blender units. So I want to move this to, right now it's at -2.25Y. That's where I have it. let's move this to -2. If you notice, I moved exactly to -2. And I want to move this to a 1. Well, where does 1 take us on the x side? Well, it takes us where across the x-axis. I'm going to just rotate everything so you can see things so that the x-axis is right and left, and the y-axis is forward and back, and the z-axis is up and down, right? And I apologize for this. So yeah, so you see that there's the, you can see that the x and y axis and so on. And if you notice here, it's at x coordinate 1. Well, that means that, see, this is the middle line, right? It's actually moved over 1 whole blender unit, right? And it's -2 from a y perspective. So if you look at the middle position, it's 1, 2. Well, what's the 2? It's the middle. Wherever the middle, because our cube starts exactly in the middle, right? So what's happened is, from the middle, I've moved it over 1 to the right and down, so -2 units down. That's what it is. It's just math, right? 1 over, 2 down, right? Okay, but I want to move it on the z-axis. I want to move it 2 up. So here I go to the location, and I change this to 2 up. And notice how it becomes closer to us. Well, what's happened actually is it's lifted off the axes by 2 units off. Now you can't see, there is no other grid that goes up and down, but you can see that it's off of the up 2 units from where it started. Okay, I'm just going to kind of zoom out here so you can see the difference, right? So it's up. If I was to put this in the exact center again, if I reset this, I can just go to 0, 0, 0. So 0, and manually 0, 0. Okay, now it's in the exact center again. Now this is because, remember, the pivot point by default is in the center of any object you create. However, this pivot point may change, and your coordinates are all going to be based on that pivot point, right? So if you manipulate an object and change the pivot point somehow, you may not get what you think you're going to get numerically. So be careful of that. Typically, by default, you will get this, you know, in the exact position you want it. Okay, so that's true. That means that in the axis, from an axis perspective, I'm just going to change the axis. You can see that the cube is half buried inside the grid, right? And if I want this cube to be exactly sitting on top of a plane that I'm going to create, I have to move it up by 1 unit, right? So I have to go up by 1 unit. So let's just do that. So 1 unit on the z-axis. So that moves up, right? Now it's going to be sitting on this. If we had an imaginary plane, we don't have one yet. But if we have an imaginary plane here, it would be sitting on top of the plane exactly, touching the plane. Okay. Hey, on that, let's add a plane. How do I add stuff with Blender? I'm going to press, when I've got my mouse in the major viewport, the main viewport here, not over here or over here or over here or down here, I can press the Shift-A key, Shift-A. And if you notice, it gives me a little menu. And there's different options. You have a curve, surface, meatball, metaball. I like calling it meatball. A text, armature, a lattice, so an empty object. There's reasons for empty objects a lot in Unity. We're going to use empty objects all the time in Unity for different things. Speaker, camera, lamp, force field, all kinds of other stuff in here. We want a mesh and we want a plane. Just add that in. Now, where is it going to appear? Wherever your 3-dimensional cursor is the answer. That's another quiz question, right? So if I click mesh plane and I say, where is it going to appear? It actually appears where your 3-dimensional cursor is. Now notice how my 3-dimensional cursor is at the 0, 0, 0 point right now. And the mesh is there, right? You can see that it's highlighted, right? But it's underneath the cube. Let's see that. How do I select the cube again? I forgot. Right click, right? Okay, now how do I move it up? The blue arrow, right? Okay, there's the plane, right? If I right click on the plane, right, it looks like, how many units is it over? It's 1 unit across by 1 unit high, right? From the center. But it's really 2 units by 2 units. That's what it is, 2 by 2, okay? By default. Notice how the dimensions tell you what they are, right? 2 by 2 with a Z dimension of 0. Whoa, that means it's like, it has no thickness at all. You're right, there's no thickness to a plane. It's absolutely 0 thickness. So be careful here. In Blender, there's no thickness. In Unity, there's no thickness. If I make walls out of planes, which I can by rotating and stuff like that, they'll have 0 thickness. Once you pass through that wall, nothing's on the other side. That's okay, because who cares about what's on the other side of a wall, right? And remember, when we play games, when we make games, everything is illusions. Everything is tricks. Smoke and mirrors is what I like to say all the time, right? What you see is not really what it is, right? Okay, so here's our plane. I want to make it bigger. I want to scale it. Well, I can press this button here and click scale, but that means I'm going to be scaling it manually, like this. So I can scale it up by pulling away or kind of coming across. Let's press escape. Escape cancels my translation, right? So, or my transform. The other way to do it is to, on the bottom, there's some actual hotkeys here on the bottom too. Notice how this is a translation, transform. This is a rotation, and brings up this object here on the bottom here. This is a scale. You can bring up these keys as well, right? These 3 keys I use a lot when I do modeling, right? So if I click one of these axes, these little squares here, when I have this key selected, this icon, which is the scale icon, right? I can scale it from different points. So I can change my object scale by pulling it in a different direction. Not the z-axis, please. Don't try and scale the z-axis because it's 0. It won't matter. If I do this, it doesn't do anything because it's still 0, right? Even if it says 3, the dimensions are still 0. So let's just undo that, right? Because you don't want to scale it at all. Leave it at 1. So these are the 2 things we can scale. So we can scale this part, and we can scale this part in a 2-dimensional object like the plane. Plane is a 2-dimensional object in 3 dimensions. I can do the same thing when it comes to my cube. I can right-click on my cube to select it, and I can scale my cube to make a different shape, right? But in this case, I do have a Z component, so I can make, you know, the cube look like whatever I want, right? Like a platform, as an example. Okay? So, location, rotation, scale, right? Translation, rotation, scale. My translate button is the G button. My rotation button is the R button. My scale button is the S button. Pretty straightforward, right? Except for the translate button. It should be a T, but it's just a G. All right, I'm just going to bring this down so you can see it again. So again, so I've kind of translated my cube. Looks more like a plane now, and I want to get it back. How do I do that? Well, my dimensions are messed, right? My dimensions have X and Y and Z. I can just change those back. I can go 2 by, 2 by 2, and now I have my cube back the way it was, right? Because that's my dimensions. I can physically change my scale by numerically here. And if I wanted to sit, if I want my cube to sit on my plane, I'm going to change this, the Z, to 1, right? This is different than in Unity. In Unity, you should change it to 0.5. You'll see why, because it's slightly different. The proportions in Unity are 1 by 1, which means it's only half from the center, as opposed to a full unit from the center in Unity, which I'll talk about again. Okay? All right, so 3 objects now we have on the screen, right? We have our plane, we have our, actually there's more than 3. There's 4 objects. We have our plane, we have our cube, we have our light, and we have our camera hiding in the background over here. There's our camera right here, right? These are all objects in Blender. In Unity, all objects, if I want to go back to when I talk about Unity, all objects are considered game objects. They're all the same, right? Not so in Blender. In Blender, they're all individual shapes, right? And they have different properties, right? When they come into Unity, they come in as a game object, okay? Okay, cool. So that's pretty cool. Where we've got this, these different objects. One object sitting on top of another one. Let's add another one. But hold on, look at my 3-dimensional cursor. You may have moved your 3-dimensional cursor way over here somewhere. Okay, and do that. Just click it somewhere else. And I want it to go back to the middle, right? So how do I move it back to the middle? Because I want my 3-dimensional cursor to come. Can you grab the door, please, friend? I want my 3-dimensional cursor to start in the middle, right? So I can press Shift S, as in Sam. And if you notice, there's a little context menu that comes up that says Selection to Grid, Selection to Cursor Offset, Cursor to Selected. I could do that. Cursor to Center, which is what I really want. Cursor to Grid, Cursor to Active. So I want Cursor to Center, and if I click on that, it puts my cursor, my 3-dimensional cursor, right back into the center of the world. Okay, so Shift S, and then Cursor to Center. Okay. So look at all the stuff we've learned already. Now you won't learn that in we won't talk about that too much in when we're doing advanced graphics. We can't. We just don't have time to talk about all this stuff. We will slowly hit it, but you're going to get an advanced take on it because you need to use Blender to model. Questions around this so far? Talked about a lot of stuff, right, so far. And I want to add one more object before we break. Let's add a sphere. So I want you to do it. Tell me what to do. How do I add another object in Blender? What's one of the ways? Okay, if it's okay if I put my cursor over here to press Shift S? Can I do that? No. I got to put my cursor, wherever my pointer is, that's what the active window is. If I put it over here, that's the active component. Here, that's the active component. I can only do Shift S here. So I go Shift S, or sorry, Shift A. Let's do that again. Shift A, and then I'm going to choose. Now there's different options: UV sphere and icosphere. UV sphere is what we want for a perfect sphere. Icosphere is a different thing. We'll try both. So here's UV sphere. And where does it appear? Oh man, how come these square objects are appearing on my manipulator arm? Why? Because I've left, if you look down here on the bottom, I've left my scale icon clicked, right? It's location, rotation, and scale, right? Location, rotation, and scale. So location is here, rotation is here, scale is here. I want to click on location, all right, for a second. And if I look at that location, and if I zoom in a little bit and kind of move around, where's my sphere? It's inside and underneath. You can see how it pops underneath, and it's inside my cube because it's exactly in the 0, 0, 0 point of the world. The world, each scene is a whole world, right? So inside my scene, there's another sphere, right? And if I want to pull it out, I can simply pull one of the arms. Let's pull it from the top, and I'm going to pull my sphere out from the top. Okay, cool. Sphere, cube are different. Cube has same things: edges, faces, and vertices. So does the sphere. If you look closely, there's edges, faces, and vertices, right? These points. However, there's a lot more of them for the sphere, yeah? That means it's a more complex object. And that means when I bring it into a game, if I bring a sphere into a game, it's way more complex and takes more CPU utilization and resources than a cube. Cube is easy, right? Less vertices and less triangles to make, right? So verts, notice on the top here it says verts 494, faces 519, triangles 974, right? Right here, it tells you how many verts, how much more complex. If I click on the right-click on the cube to select it, notice how it said doesn't change. Well, this is for the entire scene, right? Even though this is pointing at the cube, right here and right-click there, it doesn't change anything. The whole scene has this many vertices. The more complex the scene, and right now, from a memory perspective, this scene is 14.88 megs. The way it's laid out for me. It might be different for you. Okay, cool. So I've got my sphere, my cube, and my plane. Let's do a Shift A one more time. And I'm going to add a different sphere. And I'm going to add the icosphere. And this time, when I pull it up, right, I'm going to pull it up over the other one and pull it across. You can see that there's a difference, right? What's the difference? One looks like a 20-sided die, right? If you play Dungeons and Dragons, right, or some other kind of role-playing game. And the other one kind of looks more like a sphere, right? Well, why would you use one over the other? Well, icosphere can give us different shapes, not just a sphere, right? And let's get rid of these two objects. And there's a couple ways to get rid of them, right? We can do it in the inspector here on the top right corner, the outliner is what it's called. Right, I can left click on one of these objects here. So let's say the icosphere and press delete, right? Now it doesn't work. If I press X, it doesn't work. But what about if I press X over here? It does. Goodbye for the icosphere. Right click over here and press X to delete. Delete, gone, right? So that's how you can delete objects. Let's add in the sphere again, but let's move our three-dimensional cursor so that the sphere doesn't start down here. I want the three-dimensional cursor to be up here, but I want it to be in an exact location. How do I change that? Well, on the right, where you see your numeric transform panel, there is an area for a three-dimensional cursor. Right now, it's at the 0, 0, 0 point. And by the way, you can reset it there if you want. I want to move my cursor 5 units up, so into the Z. There it is, right? No unit anywhere else. So my three-dimensional cursor, where the starting location of my new object is 5 units up from the center point. Okay, cool. This is where I want my icosphere to begin, or my UV sphere. I'm going to press Shift A to add my new mesh in that location. And I'm going to click on UV sphere. Now, before touching it or moving it, notice on the left, there are some other additional options. The number of segments, the number of rings. So if I change the segment number, and you can do things by dragging things across. So if I change the segment number, I can change the way my sphere will look by default. An example is if I'm going to zoom in here so you can see what I'm talking about. Right, there's my sphere. Notice how I've increased my segments to like 83 or 100. It looks kind of weird, right? It looks like a different kind of sphere. If I zoom to the left, I can decrease the number of segments until it's not a sphere anymore, right? So this is where I can create a basic shape. A primitive is what we call it. Hint, hint, another question for the test. What are all basic shapes referred to as? Primitives. These are all primitive objects, right? So this primitive, right, which is this sphere, I can change the shape. By default, it has 32 segments, right? And I can type it in or I can drag it across just like a slider. And it also has 16 rings. If I make this have 32 rings, right, see how it becomes more complex. And notice how my verts just jump to 1,000, right? My vertices up here on the top for my scene just jumped like a crazy amount. The more complex the utilization I'm going to need to manipulate it, all right? And I have less objects than I did in my scene before, and I have 15.54 megabytes in terms of total, scene size, right? Okay, cool. That's one thing you can do. You can also increase the size here. So that's one. Let's just get rid of this thing. I'm going to get rid of my sphere now and get rid of it and put back an icosphere. So I'm going to go Shift A and go to icosphere and show you the difference. Now here's something else. It has subdivisions instead of rings and all that kind of stuff, right? It doesn't have those. So now if I reduce my subdivisions to 1, I get this, which looks like a different shape, right? So even though it's an icosphere, now it's a different shape than it was before, right? And if I increase the amount of divisions, so there's 2, here's 3, here's 4, it becomes very different, many more vertices, right? But notice how everything is triangles, not rectangles like you do for a regular sphere. This has advantages when it comes to shaping your object, right? Depending on what kind of shape you need. So primitives, although they're primitives, you can make them as complex or as simple as you like, and you can combine them with other primitives to make more complex shapes, right? That is the basics of how we do all 3D modeling, all right? Before we do any kind of manipulation of the actual sphere itself, right? Hey, let's get rid of the sphere, and let's see, do we have options like that for our cube? Let's go Shift A and add in a new cube object. Let's look on the left. Do I have options like that? Well, no. I only have the ability for me to align to view. I have my radius. I can change that. And I have my rotation, so I can detail my rotation here when it's created. But I really don't have another option like that. And let's take a look. Now I have 2 cubes in the scene, one on top of the other. Let's get rid of that one. Let's do another one. All right, let's do another shape, like, for example, a cylinder. Cylinders do have options. They have 32 vertices, right? And they also have an option to the cap fill type. Right now it's an n-gon. That means in the top, the cap, the top and the bottom of the cylinder is filled. I can turn that off. I can choose this option to say nothing. Now I don't have just a cylinder. I have it can be a cylinder that has no top and no bottom, right? And when I do that, I can also, as long as I don't change the location of my object, I can do this manipulation when I create it, right? I can change the radius, right, and the depth right away from the beginning. That's one thing I can do. All right, so we've learned about primitives. We've learned about the scene, and I want to pause here because I want to go around and make sure that everyone knows how to do this stuff, right? Remember that your first lab is due Friday, which is just getting GitHub. And how does this translate? I'm going to try and give you a little bit of an intro into Unity before we leave for the day. Okay, so let's take a short break, 5 minutes, and we'll get back into Unity when we stop.